Not all kings ruled with honor. One ruled with hunger, for flesh, for power, for silence. They called him the Orgy King. And behind his golden mask was something far more terrifying. Put on your headphones. Let the night take you. Because this is no ordinary story. It's a descent into velvet, chains, and whispered revenge. Where most kings built armies, he built bedrooms. The rise of Laurent VI, and the kingdom twisted by his hunger. The castle of Varnaria did not smell of oil and steel like other royal keeps. It smelled of roses, candle wax, and the faint perfume of sin. Its walls were not guarded by archers or filled with maps of war. Instead, they pulsed with velvet and moaned with secrets. Behind every curtain was a hidden room. Behind every room, a locked door. And behind each of those, something darker still. Laurent VI was only 19 when the crown touched his head, but his eyes already held a hunger that frightened even his tutors. Where others learned the art of diplomacy or studied the movements of stars, Laurent studied bodies, not how they lived, but how they could be bent to serve his desires. He did not dream of conquest. He dreamed of control and pleasure. His first royal decree wasn't about land or law. It was about silk, that every chamber in the castle be stripped of cold stone and lined with crimson fabric. Tapestries were torn down. Statues of warriors replaced by carvings of lovers entangled in eternal embrace. The throne itself was remade, no longer a cold chair of iron, but a curved bench of polished bone and red velvet, wide enough to seat 2 or 3. Courtiers whispered. Priests prayed. But Laurent only smiled. To him, power was not held in scrolls or armies. It was held in whispers and moans, in the desperate look someone gives when they've surrendered everything, even their shame. He filled his court with beauty. Not warriors or wise men, but dancers, actors, and creatures too strange to name. Women with eyes painted gold. Men with mouths sewn shut, dressed in silver chains. Every night, there was a new show. But the audience was always the same. Just him on his soft throne, his gaze heavy, his hand often trembling not with fear, but anticipation. And Varnaria changed. What had once been a kingdom known for its libraries and quiet meadows became something else. The streets filled with strange music, soft and hypnotic. Clothing grew thinner. Walls seemed to whisper at night. The people said nothing, not out of loyalty, but out of confusion and fear. For Laurent was not cruel in the way most kings were. He didn't burn villages or raise taxes. But he took something deeper. He rewrote the rules of love, of privacy, of worth. In his eyes, to be useful was to be desirable. And to resist desire was treason. The first true sign of change came not in the palace, but in the village square. It was market day. Families stood with baskets, children with toys. Then the trumpets sounded, but not the usual brass. These were soft flutes, played low and slow. Out stepped the new guards. Not soldiers in armor, but men in masks of gold and flowing robes. They moved like dancers, their eyes empty. Behind them, a young couple was dragged forward. Lovers who had refused to attend one of the king's intimacy festivals. Their punishment was not death. That would have been simpler. Instead, before the eyes of their neighbors, their hair was shaved, their clothes stripped, and they were paraded through the town in silence, their shame made into a stage. The crowd watched frozen, not because they agreed, but because deep inside, they were afraid they might be next. And perhaps worse still, some part of them wondered if they should have obeyed. Laurent watched it all from a tower window, sipping dark wine. Below him, the kingdom knelt, not from respect, but from exhaustion. Because rebellion does not always roar. Sometimes it whimpers. Sometimes it sighs. Sometimes it waits. And inside the palace, Laurent continued building. There was a room made entirely of mirrors, where one could never be alone, even in the dark. Another filled with cushions so soft that those who entered found it difficult to leave, forgetting time itself. And deep beneath the palace, a spiral staircase that led to the place no one dared speak of. A chamber known only as the abyss. It is said that Laurent designed it himself. That he drew it with his own hand, each curve and hallway shaped to confuse the senses. Light flickered but never revealed. Sound echoed but never arrived. And in the center, a single bed, large enough for 10, surrounded by curtains stitched with symbols no scholar could translate. What happened there is not written in any history, only the silence that followed. But the people spoke in whispers. They said the king had stopped sleeping, that he stayed in that chamber for days, painting scenes on the ceiling with red ink that smelled too strongly of iron, that sometimes screams could be heard, followed by laughter, followed by silence again. And still no one acted, because by then, Laurent had done what no tyrant ever truly could. He had not just changed the rules. He had changed the people. The farmers no longer told stories at night. They closed their windows and prayed. The children no longer played with wooden swords. They danced soft and slow, practicing for festivals they did not understand. And the priests? They stayed quiet. For even holy men must eat. And Laurent had promised them gold, if they kept their eyes closed. The world outside forgot Varnaria. Other kingdoms, hearing strange rumors, sent no messengers, no armies. They simply looked away. For what Laurent did was not war. It was something worse. Something infectious. Something shameful. But not everyone was silent. A servant girl named Mela, whose sister had vanished after being summoned to the palace, began to collect names. A baker whose wife had returned from the court unable to speak, he wrote letters. And slowly a list formed. A list of those who had lost someone. Not to death, but to desire. To the throne of flesh. They began to meet in secret, in candlelit basements, behind broken barns. They did not speak of rebellion. Not at first. Only memory. Only grief. Only what had been taken. But grief, when shared, becomes something else. One night, under the full moon, they made a vow. Not to kill Laurent. That would be too quick. But to destroy the world he had built. To tear the velvet from the walls. To crack the mirrors. To burn the masks. To remind the kingdom what love had once meant. And so the wheel turned. Laurent VI, seated on his soft throne, never saw the first blade coming, not of steel, but of memory. Not from a knight, but a mother. But that is a story for the next night. So close your eyes now. For this was only the beginning. And deeper chambers await. The eunuch guards the golden faces, the stolen voices. Loyalty was not earned, it was carved. In the dark marble corridors of Varnaria's palace, footsteps never echoed. The silence wasn't natural, it was enforced. Every whisper had been stripped from the stone, every creak trained into stillness. And those who moved through it, those tall, gold-masked figures who guarded every velvet-draped door, weren't quite men anymore. They were the hollow sentinels, the royal guard of Laurent VI. But they didn't speak. Not because they wouldn't, because they couldn't. Each one had once been a man, some once fathers, others soldiers or priests. But once they were taken into the king's service, everything about them was undone. Their tongues were severed on the day of silence, a ritual that Laurent called an offering of loyalty. Their names were forgotten, erased from every record. Their faces, permanently hidden behind golden masks, molded not in anger, but in gentle, expressionless calm. The masks never came off. Not even to sleep. Not even to weep. The people of Varnaria believed that behind each mask was a face that no longer remembered who it had been. A face twisted by silence, carved into obedience. Laurent loved them. He claimed they were the purest form of service. Loyalty without question, he once said during a public ceremony. Love without a voice to betray it. Each mask was crafted by Laurent's private goldsmith, who was rumored to have once been a philosopher. After his own tongue was taken, he stopped asking why beauty had to become horror. He simply shaped. Each sentinel was given a mask that bore a different calm expression. Some smiling, some crying, others looking upwards as if in prayer. But no eyes ever blinked behind them. The masks became a symbol, not of safety, but of fear. When one appeared in the village, children were pulled indoors. Doors shut. Shops closed. No one greeted them. You never knew why they had come. And you never asked. The masks weren't just on the guards. They began to appear in court ceremonies too. At the Festival of Obedience, a yearly event forced upon the townspeople, masks were handed to children, soft paper things painted with gold and lined with honey inside. They were told to wear them while reciting poems about service and sweet silence. The honey was to keep their mouths shut. Any child who tried to speak before removing the mask was gently scolded. Any child who refused disappeared. Parents didn't protest. They only wept in corners, holding tightly to the children they had left. And deeper in the palace, beyond the silken drapes and perfumed halls, Laurent's collection of masks grew. There was a chamber, forbidden to all but his most trusted artisans, where hundreds of masks hung on the walls. Some small, delicate, with lashes painted on. Others enormous, like those of beasts, their eyes wide and empty. Each one had belonged to someone. It was whispered that when a servant displeased Laurent, not by disobedience but by failing to amuse, he would have their mask taken and hung, and the body discarded like a toy grown dull. But to the king, it wasn't punishment. It was preservation. A face, he once said, is only worth what it can perform. Not everyone wore masks of gold. Some wore masks of behavior, of survival. The courtiers began to speak in soft voices, always agreeing, always smiling. Their laughter was never too loud. Their steps never too fast. They learned to mimic what Laurent adored. A mix of obedience, seduction, and emptiness. Women learned to smile without meaning it. Men learned to stand still no matter what they heard behind the doors. And the courtiers who lasted longest weren't the brightest. They were the best at pretending they had no soul left to break. But even perfect performances crack. One night, during a midnight gathering known as the Soiree of Stillness, one of the golden masked guards did something unheard of. He collapsed. No sound. Just the dull thud of a heavy body falling to the carpet. The music stopped. The candles flickered. For a moment, the entire room froze, not in concern but in terror. Because they had never seen one fall before. Never seen one fail. 2 other sentinels moved forward, dragging the body away without a word. Laurent stood slowly, wine swirling in his glass. Then he smiled. A reminder, he said softly to the crowd, that even perfection must be refreshed. No one ever saw that guard again. But in the following weeks, more masks were reshaped. The eyes on the new ones were slightly wider, as if afraid. Mela, the servant girl whose sister had vanished into the palace, began to notice something strange. Some of the sentinels walked with a limp. Some had hands that trembled slightly when at rest. Once, she saw one drop a tray and kneel silently, its hands shaking uncontrollably before being rushed away. They were breaking. Not quickly, but enough to show the cracks. She began to suspect that the masks weren't the source of obedience. They were the prisons for it. That behind each one was a person screaming silently, every day, forgotten but not erased. So she began to mark the masks. When cleaning the display chamber, she pressed tiny wax dots into the creases of their foreheads, one for each day since they'd stopped moving. It was her secret rebellion, her private ledger of suffering. And it grew fast. One night, she followed the artisan who molded the masks, now nearly blind, trembling with age, to a hidden kiln room beneath the castle. There, in the suffocating heat, he whispered one sentence to her as he worked. They don't die in silence. They live in it. Forever. The masks were not just tools. They were cages. And the moment they were placed on a man, his voice didn't just vanish. His identity did. But something else stayed alive, memory, regret, and perhaps rage. One evening, as the court prepared for Laurent's infamous midwinter touch ball, a night when guests wore nothing but masks and danced until dawn, something changed. A single masked guard, stationed outside the bedchamber of the king, dropped his halberd. Then slowly, he removed his mask. His face was ruined, scarred, mouth stitched once but ripped open. But his eyes burned. Not with madness. With clarity. With pain. Before anyone could scream, he spoke. His voice was broken glass. Dry, barely audible. But it carried. I remember my name. The castle froze. The other guards turned toward him. And for the first time, they hesitated. Laurent rose from his chamber in fury. But when he stepped into the hall, he saw something he had never seen in all his reign. A mask, lying on the floor. Not shattered. Not stolen. Given up. And that was the beginning. The rebellion would not come with swords or fire. Not yet. It would come with memory. With names. With the quiet defiance of those who dared to take back their faces. And somewhere beneath the palace, Mela began collecting those names. One mask at a time. One day each year, shame became ritual. The kingdom undressed itself, or bled for refusing. There was a time when the kingdom of Varnaria celebrated with light, spring festivals of color, of laughter, of dance in flower-strewn fields. That time was gone. Under King Laurent VI, only one festival remained. The Festival of Holies. It came once a year, always on the first moon of winter. The wind would still be sharp, and the trees still bare. But in the capital, preparations began weeks before. Not with song or feasting, but with silence, with dread. People whispered of it the way one might speak of a disease. Soft, cautious, and without eye contact. For on that single day, shame became law. It began at dawn. A single bell rang out, not from a church, but from the palace gates. One long, low toll that rolled across the kingdom like thunder. In homes, children were hurried behind doors. Curtains were drawn. Eyes dropped. Because after the bell, the summons began. Each village, each ward, each street received a scroll. Its red ribbon meant only one thing: selection. The names written on the scroll were chosen by palace scribes, or perhaps Laurent himself. Sometimes a family would be called. Sometimes only one name. Man or woman. Old or young. It didn't matter. There was no pattern. No logique. Only fear. Those chosen had 1 hour to arrive at the central square. And they were not allowed to arrive clothed. This was the heart of the festival. The offering of honesty, Laurent called it. A day in which the kingdom sheds its falseness and stands exposed before truth. But there was nothing honest in it. No sacredness. No kindness. Only humiliation. They came shivering barefoot, covering themselves as best they could. Sometimes they painted symbols across their skin to make it feel less raw, less real. Others simply wept. And some, the ones who had survived previous festivals, walked with their heads high, not out of pride, but defiance. All were forced to kneel before the platform of reflection. A raised dais carved from silver mirrors, polished so bright the air around it shimmered. Laurent's idea. He wanted the people to see themselves, to witness their flaws made flesh. A priest, masked in gold and draped in white velvet, would read aloud a verse from the king's own book of virtues, twisted phrases about purity, vulnerability, and the holiness of submission. As the words echoed, the crowd was forced to chant them back. Those who refused? They were stripped anyway, of garments, of voice of safety. Some were lashed. Some vanished. But what truly chilled the bones of the villagers was what came next. The circle of mirrors. One by one, the chosen were brought into a ring surrounded by towering panes of glass, each one tilted inward. They could not escape their own reflection. The crowd was forced to watch. And Laurent, seated above on his throne, would sometimes smile, sipping wine from a cup shaped like a hollowed-out apple. No one knew what he saw in those mirrors. But he always chose one. Just one person each year. This person was declared most holy. Not for virtue, but for what Laurent saw as raw beauty. It might be a scarred soldier, a silent widow, a young man too afraid to speak. It didn't matter. Each one labeled not with the name of a town but with bids, offers, barters. Lords offering gold to keep their daughters from being chosen. Merchants trading names of their enemies. Even palace courtiers, inserting the names of rivals to humiliate them in public. Shame had become a currency. And Laurent? He encouraged it. To him, the Festival of Holies wasn't about purity or truth. It was a game. A pageant of suffering that fed his desire to see the strong stripped, the beautiful broken, the proud reduced. And the people, in their silence, kept it alive. But that year, something changed. As the sanctum left the square, a single voice rose above the chant. Not a scream. Not a cry. A song. Mais la son. Softly at first, a lullaby her mother once hummed. Her voice trembled, but it did not stop. The crowd turned. The guards froze. Laurent stood, eyes narrowing. His hand rose to signal her capture. But then another voice joined hers. A woman in the back. Then a boy. Then 3, then 10. Until the entire square rang not with shame, but with sound. For the first time in years, the festival was interrupted. The chant was broken. The silence shattered. Laurent did not smile. He turned and walked back to the palace. And the next morning, no scrolls came. Mela disappeared that night. But her song remained. It echoed in the alleyways, in the corners of the city, in the mirrors of the platform, which now showed cracks where there were once reflections. The festival of Holies would come again. The king would make sure of that. But now the people knew the truth. Obedience had a mask, but resistance had a voice. Behind the throne, a place of silken horror, where screams were music and names were erased. They called it the Velvet Abyss, though no one ever spoke its name aloud. It was not marked on any map, not spoken of in any laws, and yet, it ruled the kingdom more completely than any crown ever could. It lay just beyond the royal throne, behind a pair of deep crimson curtains embroidered with gold thread in shapes that twisted like vines but resembled veins if you stared too long. To most, it was a storage chamber, or perhaps a private study for the king. But those who had seen it, or worse, heard what happened inside, knew better. It was the place where names vanished, where a person could enter whole, with memories, dreams, even resistance, and leave behind nothing but silence. It was said that the screams from inside were not only tolerated, they were amplified. The walls were lined with velvet, yes, but not to soften pain. No, velvet absorbed sound. It cradled it. It held every shriek and every sob in its fibers like secrets stitched into fabric. Some believed the abyss was alive, that it remembered every voice it had devoured. But that wasn't the horror. The horror was what it gave back. The servants knew the signs. When a noble or a soldier or a servant was summoned for private reflection, they were led not to the gardens or the library, but through the velvet doors. They never returned the same. If they returned at all, those who came back walked differently, as though their bones had been rearranged. Their faces remained, but something beneath had changed. Their eyes no longer followed movement. Their mouths smiled too often or not at all. And most disturbing of all, they no longer answered to their old names. "Where is Lady Corin?" someone might ask. The reply would come flatly, "There is no Lady Corin, only she of the silk." Or, "Sir Geron has gone." No, that is now the gasping one. It was as if the abyss renamed them, not with titles, but with identities forged by fear, molded by silence. Some speculated that Laurent VI believed true loyalty came not from duty or love, but from unmaking a person and rebuilding them into something new, something obedient. And the velvet abyss was his forge. Inside the chamber it was always warm, not cozy, but cloying, like the breath of a beast. The velvet on the walls was dark red, almost black, and thick enough to drown in. No candles were allowed, only lanterns with filtered glass that painted everything in amber, like old paper. In the center of the room stood the chair of reconciliation, a name meant to soothe, but everyone knew it as the Whisper Throne. It was not grand. It was not carved from gold or stone. It was low, soft, almost comforting, but with straps hidden in its arms. Once a person sat there, they did not rise until their voice was gone. A golden-fingered eunuch, always masked, performed the rites. It was never clear what was said inside. Some heard laughter. Others claimed to hear lullabies. But all agreed on one thing. The screaming began exactly 9 minutes after the door shut. Always 9. As if pain followed a script. And always, music was played beneath it. Not flutes or strings, but a strange humming melody, sung by a group hidden behind the walls. The same song over and over, a slow droning harmony in a tongue no one could translate. The eunuchs called it the weeping hymn. It was said that this melody could erase memories. Not like magic. Like drowning. Slowly. Repetitively. Until the mind curled inward to escape. Mela had never stepped foot in the abyss, but she had seen its doors open once. She had been delivering linens to the outer halls. A simple task. The guards had nodded her through. She had walked the corridor 100 times. But that day, the doors were ajar. And she heard something she never forgot. A voice, pleading, high and cracked, begging to remember its own name. I was Rilen. I was Rilen, please, let me keep my name. Then a low whisper. You were never Rilen. You were always the listening flame. And silence. The doors closed. The air returned to stillness. But Mela had felt it. The weight of that loss, like a candle being snuffed in a room you didn't realize was dark. Behind the scenes, Laurent's advisors used the abyss to maintain control. They would select anyone who asked too many questions. Poets, priests, even cooks. One by one, they vanished behind the curtain. And when they returned, if they returned, they were no longer threats. One scribe came back and could only write in circles, words looping endlessly without end. A guard who once led protests now stood silently at gates, smiling even when struck. The king would speak of the velvet abyss with pride. I offer redemption, he once said at court. Where others punish, I transform. I give them new life. But it was not life he gave. It was erasure. Then came the girl named Selah. She was 15. Bold. Sharp-tongued. She had laughed during the Festival of Holies when a noble tripped on his own robe. For that she was taken into the abyss. Everyone assumed she would return broken, renamed, reshaped. But she never came back. Not in a day. Not in a week. Rumors spread. Some said she had died inside. Her body kept hidden so as not to embarrass the throne. Others believed she had been too strong, that even the Whisper Throne could not unmake her. Then 3 weeks later, the humming stopped. For the first time in a decade, the weeping hymn was not heard. That night, smoke rose from the palace wing. The curtains around the velvet abyss had been burned. The throne was untouched, but the velvet, that thick voice-swallowing fabric, had been ripped, slashed, left in long curling ribbons across the floor. Selah was never seen again. But scrawled on the back of the Whisper Throne, carved by fingernail or blade, were 4 words. I remember my name. After that night, the abyss changed. Its use became rarer. Its guards doubled. The eunuchs now whispered prayers before each ceremony, hands trembling. And Laurent? He began to lose sleep. The court physician reported that the king woke often, sweating, speaking in voices not his own. Sometimes he spoke as if he were someone else entirely, using names of the erased. Names no one had dared speak aloud in years. The king began wearing gloves to bed. And the mirrors in his chamber were all covered. Some say the abyss was never a room at all. That it was a reflection, a part of Laurent himself, a hunger he could not feed. That each person broken in that velvet chamber added another crack to his mind. That Selah's act of resistance had turned the abyss back on its maker. Now whenever the wind moves through the broken eastern corridor, guards swear they hear soft singing. A child's voice, repeating one line, over and over. I was never yours. Here is your full 1,500-word cinematic sleeping story script for When the Generals Stayed Silent. It was the women who sharpened knives. Memory turned to rebellion. They were not soldiers. They did not wear armor, nor shout in parades, nor polish the blades of war. They wore aprons. They boiled rice. They braided the hair of daughters who were no longer there. And yet they remembered. The kingdom forgot. Or pretended to. The men in polished boots bowed deeper to the king with every passing year. The priests praised his divine passions. The generals, once defenders of the people, drank heavily and stared at nothing. But the mothers, they kept count. Then came the night of the Feast of Light, a holy celebration. Candles were lit across the kingdom. The king himself appeared at the balcony, robed in white, flanked by gold-masked guards. The crowd cheered. Then someone screamed. Below the palace, the great reflecting pool had been dyed blood red. Not real blood, but colored water, thick and shocking in the lantern glow. Floating on its surface were dozens of wooden dolls, hand-carved, all missing mouths. And around the rim of the pool, in 100 different hands, candles were raised, held only by women. The king stared down in horror, because in every flickering flame, he saw something he could not silence. Memory. The generals called for arrests, but the guards hesitated. Some of them had lost mothers too. Some of them had sisters who vanished behind velvet. Some of them saw in those candles what they had forgotten. A truth too bright to deny. From that night forward, the kingdom shifted. Not with swords, but with whispers. In the bakeries, songs were sung that told forbidden names. In markets, old women sold bundles of sage with hidden notes inside. In the palace laundries, gowns were stitched with secret seams, woven with tiny prayers, tiny truths. And slowly, even the powerful began to break. A court musician whose daughter had gone missing stopped playing during a royal procession. A midwife refused to bless the queen's pregnancy, muttering, "Let no child be born into this darkness." A young maid, once silent, slapped a noble for calling her mother a troublemaker. The king tried harder to erase them. He closed schools for girls. He banned red cloth. He outlawed gatherings of more than 5 women at a time. But it didn't work. Because the rebellion had moved into the body. It lived in lullabies sung under breath. In the way bread was broken at dinner. In the tears wiped away not with grief, but with rage. And then came the velvet bloom. It was spring. In every village, overnight, a strange flower appeared. Deep red, soft-petaled, growing in the cracks of stone walls and rooftops. No one knew how they had grown so fast. But every child recognized them, even the silent ones. Because mothers had taught them the name. Remembrance. The king ordered the flowers burned. But the fires would not catch. Every time the torches were raised, wind came. Or rain. Some said the sky itself had joined the mothers. Jarell never saw the throne fall. But she saw something better. One morning in the temple square, a little girl walked barefoot to the center. She carried no sword. She wore no crown. But in her hand was a doll. And when she reached the fountain, she whispered a name into the wind. One of the erased. A name that hadn't been spoken in 10 years. And the crowd whispered it back. Like a wave. Like a resurrection. That day no guard stepped forward. No generals gave orders. The king watched from his tower, trembling, as the sound grew louder. Not of war. Not of fire. But of names. Thousands of names. spoken not with anger, but with love so deep it could shatter marble. And in that moment Laurent Six finally understood. You can command silence, but you cannot unmake a memory that has taken root in a mother's heart. It will grow. It will bloom. And one day, it will return to the throne, not for revenge, but for remembrance. Here is your 1,500-word emotional, cinematic sleeping story script for. Surrounded by dying lovers, he painted sin on his ceiling in blood, and died fulfilled. The palace was quiet now. Gone were the songs, the feasts, the parades of velvet and gold. The silks hung still. The throne stood empty. And in the highest tower, under a dome painted in crimson and ash, Laurent Six was dying. But he was not alone. No king dies alone when his love has always been worship. No matter how twisted, how cruel, how broken. They surrounded him, the remnants of his court. Not the ministers or priests or generals, but the ones who had shared his bed, his secrets, his darkness. Some had once been dancers, others poets. Many had no names anymore. They sat now in silence, eyes hollow, breath slow, their bodies failing from slow poison. A gift from Laurent himself. He had prepared them a final feast, not of food, but of beauty. He had always believed beauty was pain, art was obedience, and love was possession. And so, as his own body began to decay, swollen from drink, blackened from disease, he found clarity in death. He would turn his end into a masterpiece. He ordered the walls stripped bare, the ceiling scrubbed clean. He dismissed the last servants. Only his lovers remained, and from their blood he began to paint. Each stroke was a memory. Here, in a swirl of maroon, was the smile of the boy who had sung to him the night his father died. There, a burst of black and red for the girl who dared to challenge him with her poetry, and who paid for it with her tongue. And in the center, a sun gold at the edges, rusted at the core, was himself, arms wide, mouth open, laughing at God. He called it the kingdom of flesh. He whispered that when historians came, if any dared, they would see it and understand that pleasure was power, and power was divine. But no historian ever came. No scribes dared walk the halls. Only the scent of decay filled the tower now. And still he painted. Outside, the world shifted. The rebellion had grown. The mothers who remembered were now leaders. The people no longer whispered. They shouted. Statues of Laurent had been pulled down, melted into bells that tolled for the lost. Temples had been rededicated, not to gods but to truth. And yet Laurent remained untouched, a ghost in his crimson cathedral, until the day the doors finally creaked open. It was not soldiers who found him. It was a boy, barefoot, no older than 10. He had wandered in, chasing the echo of a forgotten melody. He climbed the spiral stairs, past silks stiff with old blood, past halls where no one had walked in months. And there, under the dome, he saw the king. Laurent did not look like a king anymore. His crown had slipped sideways. His skin was gray-blue, veins stretched like vines. He was lying in the center of his mural, one hand still raised, a brush of bone between his fingers. Around him, the final circle of his lovers, still and cold, like petals fallen from a monstrous flower. And on his face was a smile, a wide gaping smile, not of joy, not even madness, but of satisfaction, as if the masterpiece was finished, as if in all the pain he had created, He had finally found something he believed would last. The boy did not scream. He did not cry. He only looked. And he saw something Laurent never expected. He saw ugliness. Not horror. Not tragedy. Just the sad, lonely rot of a man who thought love could be taken, not given. The boy walked to the far wall, dipped a finger in the dried red smear, and wrote a single word. Forgotten. Years later, the tower was sealed. The mural faded. The ceiling flaked. And Laurent 6 became a name children whispered when they misbehaved. A bedtime warning. A shadow in history. But that smile, the last smile of a man who thought he had won, was never truly gone. It was etched into the memories of those who survived. And they told their children, beware the kings who call cruelty love. Beware the ones who make beauty from screams. Beware the smile of the satisfied tyrant, for it hides the deepest rot. And so the kingdom healed. Not quickly, not cleanly, but with every whispered name remembered, with every stolen voice restored, with every daughter who danced again without fear. Laurent faded, until all that remained of his reign was a crumbling ceiling, a forgotten painting, and a story told softly, as children drifted to sleep.